Welcome to the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters, a regular forum of various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of web pages. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, a senior fellow with the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by Hardy Bouillon, who wrote one of the response essays for our May 2021 forum on Wilhelm Humboldt. If you'd like to watch any of the other interviews by the authors for this forum, or any of the other interviews in this series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself on the Online Library of Liberty is also on our YouTube channel. Hardy Bouillon is extracurricular professor of philosophy at Trier University, Germany. He studied philosophy and art history at the universities of New Mexico, Oxford, and Trier. He's a member of the Mount Pelerin Society, and he's taught at several other European universities and has authored or edited nearly 30 books and more than 160 articles published in Chinese, English, German, Italian, Romanian, Turkish, and Vietnamese. His more significant publications include Government, Servant or Master, Values in the Social Order, Libertarians and Liberalism, Ordered Anarchy, and In Loyalty to Liberty. His most recent English monograph, Business Ethics and the Austrian Tradition in Economics, was released in 2011. Hardy, it's a great pleasure to have you at the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Well, it was great to have you as part of the forum, and I know that you've long been a fan of Humboldt, and I know you've participated in a number of our in-person programs as well as written for us in the past. I guess I wanted to start actually with a sort of little biographical question. The distinction between Wilhelm and his brother has come up, and the sort of interesting background that Eduardo gave us and that also Michael gave us in the forum so far. Can you share what you would like, that you think our viewers ought to know about Humboldt, the person, because he's not exactly the most well-known of thinkers that Liberty Fund publishes or that come out of this period?
That's right. And this is still a miracle, or riddle to me, why he's not so well known. In Germany, he was one of the co-founders of the university in Berlin. He was the inventor of the system, having professors who do both research and teach. And he should be known much better than he is today. Of course, his brother was an explorer. He toured the world, so that's one of the reasons why he's more well known than his brother. But still, I think Wilhelm von Humboldt deserved much more being known to a broader audience than he does today.
It's interesting you note that he helped found the university, and yet he was opposed to public education. And this is a topic that's come up in some of the other interviews.
Right, yes.
There's some tensions in here. We'll talk about some of those tensions hopefully a little further on, but a very interesting person. So let's start with a debate that you and Michael Bentley, our lead author, have had over this forum, and that is about how large was the state during Humboldt's time? Michael claims that it was not as significant as it later became. You make the claim that it was already by Humboldt's life quite large. Can you explain why, for our viewers, you believe the state in Humboldt's time was already significant enough to be a threat to liberty?
Well, I think 2 points should be made here. One is that there is one paragraph in his book, and we have to remember that he was in his early 20s when he started writing it. And most of it was composed when he was in his early 20s. So he had some experience in the Prussian state, worked for it 15 months before he quit and was not very happy, obvious. And in this paragraph, we have everything that was already existing in terms of methods, what areas can be reached by the state, by state intervention. This is one. The other is the religious impact. I think it's important we think of Humboldt, and in the back there is Frederick the Great, the huge Enlightenment philosopher also, by the way. But in his days was more important the nephew of Frederick the Great. And he was the one responsible for the religious edict that came then around 1788 and introduced many, apart from a few, guarantees to liberty in religious terms to several groups, introduced also lots of limitations and giving positive descriptions how to have the mass organized and so forth for few religious parts, and those who were accepted had to be silent about the religion. I mean, what is religious freedom about if you do not go out and tell everybody, well, you belong to that confession and you are a Jew and you do not have a problem? But that was not allowed, and we should take that as I think, massive intervention into personal freedom.
So so let's get a sense as to what the thinking behind that edict was. Was the thinking to try to limit the freedom of religion, or was the thinking to try to limit the public discourse of a religion, to try to create an atmosphere that was different about it? What motivated that edict that you discuss?
Yeah, well, there was one person, Werner, who was behind all that, and he wanted to have his Lutheran group to be positively discriminated against all others. So the Catholics had drawbacks, and other groups too. On the other side, what has to be seen, there were clear paragraphs guaranteeing people religious freedom. Religious freedom was guaranteed, but it was with restrictions, and I think that makes the difference. And it's not so that only Frederick the Great was in the back and creating all the circumstances which were relevant. There were a few changes, unfortunately, to the worse, we should say, under his nephew.
So why was religious freedom, what was the general state of religious freedom throughout Europe during this period? How was Germany unusual with this edict, or was this edict more a sort of common approach to handling the diversity of different kind of religious faiths in Europe in this time?
Yeah, well, that was for Prussia. And it has also to be seen in conjunction with another development taking place at the same time, that preußische Landesrecht was reformed. And so what they tried to do, give it a kind of formation of freedoms guaranteed and only few restrictions. We have to say, and if you go back to the debate where it's not that in the size and reach out of the restrictions, the state of Humboldt was as big as our states. Obviously not. But the structure was already there. It's not something that they were, so to speak, more or less in heaven or close to it, and then came an invention in the mid-19th century that changed everything. I think that's not the proper picture I would see here or paint.
And to a certain extent, I gather the freedom of religion would have been a lot more important based on the number of people who were actually practicing religious faiths and believed during this period than we might consider it to be today. Does that sort of play into this as well? The importance of religion in all this discussion?
Well, I here would be not so much say loaded with details in order to give a proper answer to that. Well, these differences are very significant, to be honest.
Okay. But philosophically speaking, it's still important that religion animates a belief of thought and a belief of speech and a belief of communication that's fundamental in your view and in Humboldt's view. Sure. Yeah.
And to Humboldt too. And he made that clear. And I mean, morals were so important to him. And so religious rules cannot take over and give people clear signs in which way they have to organize their moral lives. And he asked much more, as you know, that people, when they behave morally, even if they do it in ways that is not acceptable to others, the others can go away. And having that right to leave the places in public should guarantee you to be, even if you behave obscene and dubious in moral terms, others have to accept it.
So was Humboldt himself a religious person?
Not that I would know of, that he was very much concerned, but that's simply a question I cannot answer definitely.
But he was aware of the importance and generally recognized that importance in society.
Yes, that is quite obvious from his writings. But whether that was important to him, he follows, so to speak, the rules of the day. But whether he was particularly religious in comparison to others, that is beyond my knowledge.
That's okay. So let's turn to something you say in your essay that I found very interesting, and I just wanted some clarification for, and I hopefully our viewers will get a chance to read the essay and help them work through as well. At one point, you argue that reason leads us, or leads Humboldt, to the conclusions about what he believes the limits of the state should be. And can you walk our viewers through how you believe Humboldt reasoned to the contours of the powers in his ideal state?
That's one of another, areas where I'm not sure what exactly he was up to. He simply states that it's reason, the reason that dictates what we have to do. It's not the transient desires we might have and changing ones from one day to another. And he gives no explanation. He simply puts it that way, and as if it were obvious.
So can you speculate as to what he was saying when he said what he meant when he said that? Can you, as a philosopher, sort of try to work through how he reached through reason this limited state?
Well, you have it's not so to speak. He's not the only one. We have to think of John Locke, for instance. He spoke of the common sense, and if you simply say there is something like reason or there is common sense, and now I give you my interpretation, and that's the one that should be accepted, then you can count certainly on a few members or several members who say, well, you are right, that's my same sense of reason or common sense. But it's not very satisfying to the philosopher who wants to get more than simply that statement, because it's a postulation and that's it.
So
but we should be clear, he's not a philosopher. That's not, he's very systematic thinker, but being a philosopher and a systematic thinker, that I think is not necessarily the same thing.
Okay, now several of the other folks that we've interviewed and have also written on this mention the importance of Schiller and Kant in his thought. Is it possible that that's what he's referring to, that there is something systematic in the way those authors approach the notion of reason to get him to this point where he believes the state should be limited?
That might be the case. In those days, the shades of Kant were still very long ones, and that he was taken by that, and obviously do not get into that and leave that subject to someone who was superior to him. Perhaps that is an explanation, but that's sheer guessing, I would say. And one should make it not such that simply because that is very close to be assumed, take it as a clear, proper answer to the question one might have. It's not clarified. And I remember a discussion with one of his autobiographers in Germany, who's long time dead. He knew all the details, but he could not give an answer to that question at that time in different wording. So I cannot offer one, even not someone stolen from a colleague.
So we're painting a picture of a more mysterious figure, and part of this I think is interesting because, as you said, he casts such a long shadow over German educational history and linguistics as well. He's someone who's incredibly important. Let's talk a little bit about one of the things he makes a little bit clearer in his paper, or in the book, actually, I should say, and that is the importance of what he calls a variety of situations. Mm-hmm. Right? What you call in your essay the variety of situations. Now, I think today we've been so influenced by someone like John Rawls, for example, mm-hmm. as a philosopher, who is trying to present us with a sort of minimum floor of opportunity that individuals should be given, but that floor is more homogeneous, that there is less diversity within that floor. Humboldt makes a very different kind of argument. Can you explain for the viewers what kind of argument he makes as compared to the sort of minimum floor of more homogeneous opportunities, and why Humboldt believed his alternative was superior for freedom?
Yes, the comparison to Rawls is very helpful in that respect. For people like Rawls, the question how to put this and how to do this was not so important. It's clear that the state should take over, others should take over, to make the variety of situations as big as possible. But Humboldt had a completely different approach. His approach was that variety simply comes about by the interactions of free people. And if you have the maximum of freedom given to everybody, then you have the maximum floor for the variety of situations, because everybody doing his private business can offer, by doing so, going into interaction with other people, giving them the chance to take that opportunity to do something in order to pursue their own ends. And by doing so, add something to the use of their powers, which is very important to Humboldt. Using the powers, the mental powers, physical powers as well, psychic powers. And that is only possible if you have a chance to interact with other people. And it's very simple and very sympathetic approach to libertarians and classical liberals.
Absolutely. I was just thinking, so if you could explain for viewers who are perhaps less familiar with the way libertarians and classical liberals talk, why would it be the case that a sort of government, I don't want to use the word mandated, but a kind of a government provided or a public sector provided set of opportunities would be less diverse than a set of personal interactions that individuals might have themselves? Why would we think that individuals in the public sector would be less likely to create the various ranges of opportunities that people in the private sector would create?
That's right. I mean, that is something that people would bring up and say, well, listen, if you have the state, he has a different variety of things, so it adds to the table, so to speak, or adds to the tableau. In the first instance, that might be right, but the consequences were clear to Humboldt, and he puts it. If you do that, you start uniformity, because the state is not the one who is looking for diversity. He has an idea, and he brings about that what the leading people in the state have as ideas. And by doing so, they need, of course, money to produce it. And they take the money from others who had different ideas and would have given other opportunities to others by using the money privately. And so in the end, that's not possible. I think that was one of the motives. We spoke about that earlier, that he left the state. He was not very good in state as a state officer. So he realized that if you are there, you have to do routines. And that is what the state is standing for, having these routines, not adding to diversity, but having one size for all, regulations for all, and all that. And that kills what is inside you, your interest in looking for different options and creating something new. That is not what the state is capable to do.
And in contrast, the market provides a wider range of opportunities. And why would that be the case as compared to the state? Because I think you make a pretty strong case that the state, as a collection of routinized, it's essentially a group of routinized practices that is set out through rules and regulations, and perhaps less conducive to entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurship of the market, why is that going to provide us with greater opportunity and such?
Yes, the state needs to take away. He has to restrict the individual. And if the individual is restricted, cannot offer opportunities to others, forms of interactions. And all these variations are taken away from all others. And so by necessity, there is no way to circumvent that.
It's an interesting point. I think one that with those of us who tend to be defenders of liberty, we don't think so much about this, but this diversity of opportunity and the way the market can imagine things as compared to the way the public sector can is and I think it's been very powerfully displayed during the past 18 months as we've fought this pandemic, when businesses have done a pretty tremendous job adapting to these circumstances, and the public sector has been more routinized and has really struggled to break out of its rules and practices. So this is an interesting point that Humboldt has for us. As we conclude in your essay, there's an interesting point you make about a fellow who dies in a balloon accident. Can you explain the circumstances surrounding that accident? And then I want to ask you a question about Humboldt's thought. What exactly was that reference you made at the very end of your essay?
I want to make clear whom he had in mind. It was not the particular sort of people. He collected a few soldiers, and Montgolfier in that particular case was the one who provided the balloon. And so Pilato was capable of doing something that was completely unusual of his state. I think that's quite a personal impression, or it gives lays bare as personal trait Humboldt probably had, being so interested in people who are taking these risks. I mean, go on a balloon, these were not so well known in those days, and included high risks, and you simply want to do it. And the same if somebody takes care of of being interested in provide and to protect one's own country. You take the risk. And if you are part of a standing army, you do not have that spirit any longer. But you need people, and they are spirited if they have the opportunity to use whatever others are offering them freely.
So you make a claim, and I guess the analogy really to balloon travel in that period would be like space travel today, correct? I mean, that it was so unusual and it was so difficult. Would that be a fair comparison?
I would say yes, that's a quite good comparison. I mean, if you want to see the balloon on the Mars, it's possible. You have a couple bucks left for that trip.
I guess I was just thinking about Jeff. I saw the other day that Jeff Bezos is going to fly in his first space trip, and Richard Branson's involved in this, and Elon Musk, and so these people seem to turn to space immediately, and it seemed like a sort of an apt comparison. But what you seem to implicitly say about Humboldt is really interesting to me, because it seems to me that what Humboldt wants is he wants risk-taking, bravery. It's not merely diversity; it's taking on the risks associated with it. So I have a sort of broader philosophical question: is the ultimate threat to liberty for Humboldt fear, trepidation, the temptation to avoid risk? Is that really what he's trying to get at and most concerned about here? There's a boring sort of stability to the process?
In a way, yes, but it's more that he does not like the risk being taken away. If you have a risk and you are free to take it, that's fine. You still can, depending on your personal mood, the attitude not to go on that trip, either to the moon or in a balloon. But you should have the option, and you widen, obviously. I think what my personal impression of Humboldt was that he wants to widen his horizon, and go on trips is, of course, a very nice metaphor for that particular attitude you might have. So that would be my answer. Not so much that I think the way you put it gives it a different direction, which I could not see if I try to recapitulate my reading of Humboldt. It's more that somebody can take away your fear. That's a problem, because even if you have the chance to go to war, that should be given to you, and you might risk your life and that of your family, but that's a decision you take. So and you can sense more, find out about yourself if you take these risks. People like mountain climbers, for instance. Oh my goodness, many people would say, me included, why do they do that? I mean, they can fall down and break their neck, and that's it. But if that is widening their horizon, Humboldt will be clearly on their side.
But you'd also point out in your essay that Humboldt would not have allowed individuals to allow themselves to be voluntarily enslaved. That's right. How does that distinction work in Humboldt?
Yes, my solution to the problem is he has a few areas where freedom is limited, this being one. And if you go for on a suicidal course, you, of course, should not have the help of the doctors, because that could be misused. That's his explanation. And it seems to be that the line of argument is, if there is a vital threat, then that should be limited to the least amount possible. But that is on the other side, so to speak, the point where the systematic breaking point is. Because what is that? Where do you set then the limit? We can explain or interpret many situations in the same way that it's very detrimental to your vitality, to your health and all that. So you should not do that. And then in the end, you should not cross a street, because you might run into a car. And that's certainly a problem. He had that in mind, the same whole that you should not give away everything. These fideicommissa, for instance, which were perhaps for personal note that he wanted to have his personal situation safe, might be, but that is the best explanation I can give. at least that is, so to speak, the point which you can identify the several places where he makes these exceptions.
It's interesting because when I think about mountain climbing versus, say, enslaving yourself, it's pretty clear that there is a gap in the risk of the outcome. So when you enslave yourself, you're 100% certain that you're going to be giving up your life to another person. There's very little risk and very little upside to that. But in the case of mountain climbing, the risk is significantly higher than it would be crossing the street. And yet he encourages that kind of risk taking, and he wants a society that's dynamic enough to provide that. But as you say, drawing that line is certainly difficult. One final question.
Marriage, by the way.
I'm sorry?
Marriage, by the way. I mean, that's...
Yes.
I'm looking it up, but that's a point he too has, where you can say, well, why should you be in the situation that if you're not happy with your marriage, you can simply quit and the contract is dissolved. But that's another point where you can say, well, yes, if you make a decision, he was happily married with Caroline von Dachauer at that time. But if you make that point, obviously, you think it could be the situation that you run into deep problems if you are committed to a person for your entire life. So you should have the option to go away, split up.
It is hard to put limits on these things, and I think that's one of the things that the defenders of liberty have struggled with, is how to argue through the exact limits and how they should be played out. The precautionary principle being perhaps the one thing that's emerged that might be directly related to him. One final question, and that is, I think the more we learn about psychology, experimental psychology, genetics, we've learned that people seem to be predisposed either in favor of or against risk, relatively speaking, and that's related to responsibility. So to what extent is Humboldt's vision of the free society reasonable considering what we know now about propensity towards risk? And to what extent is it idealized, or is it simply an aspiration? Is it something that we should strive to achieve through encouraging people to engage in these sorts of risk, or is it unrealistic because we just know that people aren't going to be as risk-taking and as open to diversity as he might have hoped?
Yeah, well, two answers. One is a systemic one. What you read out of his book, and that is simply it's a logical implication that you should be happy about risk, because that's part of the total scenery. If you have a variety of situations, then among those situations are those who are loaded with risk, higher risk, and you're free to take them on. On the other side, that's between the lines, he obviously has a personal tendency towards riskier operations. He seems to be an admirer. There's a long paragraph about the life of the soldiers in ancient times, and obviously he was very enthusiastic about those lives, perhaps very idealistic. That's not very unusual of the time, but it seems to be a part that speaks out of his personality.
Hardy Bouillon, thank you very much for taking the time to be part of the Author Interviews for Liberty Matters, and thank you for writing a very provocative essay, and thank you for providing us with a very thoughtful culinary analogy as well. I think the ingredients you added to the Chef Bentley's initial essay were very, very useful, and thank you very much for taking the time to be part of the interview process.
Yeah, well, thank you for putting such an interesting group together. That's very stimulating, and I think something we all can use in those days.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Thank you.